Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Monday Night Conscious Community Class with me, Matthew Brownstein, streaming live online at Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And tonight's class, which my Outlook is giving me a reminder about, is Transcending the Dysfunctional Psyche. This will relate to next week's class as well, dealing with the opening heart teaching. So tonight we're going to dive into an understanding of hypnotherapy in relationship to functioning outside of hypnotherapy, in the sense that we, who might be listening to this now, are hypnotherapists. We're practicing ideally some form with some level of state licensed diplomas in either hypnotherapist, clinical, transpersonal, or our branding, interpersonal hypnotherapist. But however you're working with people, one way or another, you're dealing with the psyche. You're dealing with something that usually we call somewhat dysfunctional. I'm going to define the terms tonight. We're going to go into those deeply, but I do want to start by saying, with somewhat of a disclaimer, we're not talking about dysfunctional in the sense of pathological. The word here isn't a diagnostic or therapeutic term. It's just saying when things aren't working right. So as hypnotherapists, we deal with that. Things that aren't working right? You want to stop smoking, you can't stop smoking. You want to lose weight, but you keep emotionally overeating. All right, we're just talking about a part of you that's not okay. And we'll be looking at these different parts in relationship to more than just a private hypnotherapy practice, yet what it's like just to simply be living your life, right, from day to day. And then the word transcendence we'll look into. What do we do with a dysfunctional psyche? Meaning a part of you that's just not okay, maybe a significant part of you that's not okay. And what happens if we rise above it? Is there something called transcendence? Does it mean you have to leave your body or ascend up to other planets or, dimensions to get out of your dysfunctional psyche? Or do you deal with it directly? Do we know how to drop into it and actually help to resolve it? Or are we just sitting above it and watching it? So that's just a general overview of what we're getting into tonight. On our next slide, again, my name is Matthew Brownstein, in case you don't know. A lot of our work deals with what I and others call life mastery. It's about being successful in every aspect of your life. Yet when it comes down to it, the mind is always going to be a major part of that work, right? Like you want to get your body in good shape. It takes the mental effort. It takes having your mind in the right place. You want to have spiritual awareness, but you can't quiet your mind. You don't have a comfortable heart. What's going on in there is just not feeling good, right? And how could we say we have a sense of self-actualization or life mastery, or even be working towards it, if we still have a mind that we might call dysfunctional? So life mastery can be an overview of how we can say, well, when is it not dysfunctional, right? When is it actually going well? To understand that model, to move towards health, to move towards wholeness, to move towards self-actualization, we want to define that a little bit, because a lot of the models in Western medicine and psychology are looking at illness or mental illness and then working to move away from that. But really, we just end up with a system of diagnosis, medication, and sometimes, maybe not all the time, but ineffective styles of facilitation. What happens if we honor a movement towards wholeness, a movement towards life mastery, a movement towards oneness? We simply keep our eyes on the destination, our eyes focused on the light, focused on the goal. The closer we get to the light, the more we see our shadow. Right, so I invite you to perhaps take a breath and take inventory of your life right now, to ask yourself perhaps what might be dysfunctional, what isn't working well. So if you ask yourself about your spirituality, do you feel that you're truly connected? Do you have true inner peace? Have you tapped into love, however you would talk about that, but love within you, not just love for somebody else? So unconditional love, self-love, divine love. However you would define spirituality, is it robust? Is it fulfilling? Is it truly enriching? We, of course, have our mental emotional health in a life mastery model. We're going to spend a bunch of time in that tonight. The theme, though, is not just to consider the psyche, this thing in your head, but to give a lot of attention to the heart as well. Our hearts are the roots of our minds, right? What you feel here, the mind is going to talk about. And if this isn't okay, This is going to keep chatting, right? We have a subconscious and a conscious. At this stage of our discussion tonight, as I ask you to take inventory in you, how is your heart? The great poet Jalaluddin Rumi, he wrote, "Beauty harsher than 1,000 suns broke into my house, asked, how is your heart? His robe of glory trailed the floor. I said, pick up your robe, the house is floored in blood." That's a little Rumi for you. So he said, beauty harsher than 1,000 suns, right? Light broke into my house, into my own being, into my own body, into my own awareness. Asked, how is your heart? Right? What's going on in there? His robe of glory trailed the floor, meaning I was in this presence of awe and wonder, however you might define that. And he said, pick up your robe, the house is floored in blood, meaning I'm wounded. My heart hurts. I've been going through this agony of inner transformation. What do we do with that? How do we handle what's going on inside? But again, relate that to the bigger picture. So we've got our spirituality, we've got our mind, we've got our heart, and then we have our body. Again, are you exercising well? Are you eating healthy? Is your body healthy? If you're dealing with any type of psychosomatic illness for yourself or your clients, then we really want to ask what's going on in the mind that's causing this problem in the body, right? How much illness is psychosomatic? So when I say a dysfunctional psyche, any part of your mind that causes disharmony, ill health, physical imbalance, or lack of healthy lifestyle is in that category. So I hope you're personally assessing these things as we move along, so that when we get into solutions tonight, right, you might start to say, I know what to do with that thing now. That part of me that never stops criticizing me, that part of me who I can't get to get a good night's rest because it won't be quiet, or the part of me who won't stop overeating, or whatever else it is. In Life Mastery, we also look at your career and finances. How much of that is based on your mind, and how much of disharmonious financial situations is based on a dysfunctional psyche? Right? We all every moment have the chance to make new choices. Are we choosing prosperity? Are we choosing abundance? Are we choosing to be really solid and secure during very tumultuous times right now? What are we doing with our mind? Are we just hoping? Are we just sticking to our current thing? Or are we developing 7 lucrative sources of income? Are we constantly learning about what's happening out there? Right, that whatever you're doing to improve your financial situation is a mental process, and a dysfunctional psyche, the way I'm defining it, is saying it's not going to help you to succeed. Also, of course, your relationships. How does a dysfunctional psyche ruin relationships? Every interpersonal conflict is essentially somebody's dysfunctional psyche probably bumping up against somebody else's dysfunctional psyche. Right, so those are the main categories of life mastery: your spirituality, mental emotional health, physical health, career and finances, and relationships. Your mind is going to affect all these other aspects of your life. Your housing situation. Is your house clean? Are you a hoarder? What is that? That's your mind, right? If your mind is in a good place, you clean up after yourself. If not, maybe the house is a mess, or you don't have your dream house. Right? How do we move towards that? It's always a mental shift. It's not just waiting until it appears, right? But a dysfunctional psyche with negative programming about housing. I had a client I remember who grew up in a very messy household, and she kept having a messy house herself. The psyche, the child ego state, if you will, needs to keep a connection with the parent. And what we found out with her was, well, if I clean my house, if I go beyond my mom and dad, I'm being disloyal to my mom and dad. It was an inner child's way of keeping a connection. So messy house equals dysfunctional psyche. Life Mastery also looks at your transportation, right? Do you have a nice car? Do you like the vehicles that you drive? Is it easy to get around, right? That's a big mental choice as well. And then other things like your free time and vacation, or free time and recreation. What do you kind of do daily to enjoy your life? Your travel vacation, right? All of these things, your education, like we're a hypnotherapy school, your ability to succeed in this school has everything to do with your mind. Okay, so all major 10 life categories that we look at in the Life Mastery course essentially all require that your mind is in a good place. Okay, next. Feel free, these nights I'm mostly just talking, but feel free to ask questions or to share anything using the comments, and I'll be sure to respond to them. We'll try to keep class under an hour tonight, perhaps closing with a meditation. Let's see how that goes, but also to be a bit more succinct. All right, so transcending, that's the first word in our topic tonight. Transcending the dysfunctional psyche. What do we mean by transcending? To transcend is to rise above. All right, and therefore there has to be one thing that can rise above another thing, or one thing that can rise above a bunch of things. To know who's transcending, we really want to say, well, who are you? Right? Because if I say you can transcend your psyche, well, who are you? Right? If we can say you can transcend your body, you can transcend your heart. And where's the value in that? Is it actually something you want to do? Or is there a possible trap in trying to get above all of it? But let's understand the term first. If you right now just observe your hand, you're aware of your hand, right? Your hand is in your awareness. Therefore, we could say you're not in your body. We could say the body is in you if we define you as awareness, right? You're aware. If we removed your hand, you'd still be aware. If we remove both hands, you're still aware. We could remove both arms and legs and you would still be aware. That you is what I'm suggesting here, is the one who transcends the human. Now, if you're going to call that you spirit, we'd be on the same page, but you don't have to call it that. You could simply say that you is consciousness. If the consciousness just arises from the brain, the idea of transcendence doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if you're the consciousness having a human experience, it makes a lot of sense. So if you're a spiritual being having a human experience, transcendence is absolutely a worthwhile topic. If you're just a brain, how does the brain transcend the brain, right? The deeper spiritual models across the board say you, whatever that you is not a brain. If you study the work of heart math, this idea of brain, mind, or heart-brain coherence, or just heart-mind coherence, the idea that you're a heart is a major part of your psyche as well. In the Chinese system, I studied Chinese medicine primarily. The model is that the Shen, S-H-E-N, lives in the heart. And if you ask a lot of Easterners, for lack of a better term, where is your mind? Quite often they point to the heart. So I'd like you to consider that the you who can transcend is not your heart and is not your mind, right? You could observe what's in your heart, and you can observe what's in your mind. So then the question is, who are you? Right? When you have an emotion come up, you feel an emotion come up. There's a you and an emotion. It would be slightly inaccurate to say something like, I am angry. It would be much more accurate in this model to say, I'm observing anger. When we're caught up in it, we don't know the I am from what it's observing, right? It's I am angry. Rather, you can say, I am observing anger. Hello, Rhonda, who said, I love and appreciate how you are so profound and decisive in your explanations and wording. Thank you, Rhonda. Appreciate that. And guys, feel free to interact with me, even though I've been making this more lecture-based since we've restarted again. So you are not your emotions and you are not your mind. How do you know you're not your mind? Just take a moment and listen to your own thoughts. Do a little inner experiment so you know what I'm talking about in this idea of transcending. Let your mind right now just go blah, 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 blah. Just start blah, blah in your head. Do you hear that voice in there? Just like you can hear my voice, you can hear your voice. Just as you hear me speaking English, let your mind, your conscious mind right now, say something in English internally. Let it say, I speak English. Now let it talk like Daffy Duck, which I can't do, or Donald Duck. I can't do the voice, but let it make some really funny voice in your head and say, I don't speak English. It doesn't matter whether it's accurate or not. Let your mind say 2 + 2 = 4 and listen to it. Like really let 2 + 2 = 4. I can hear that inside, right? Now let it say 2 + 2 = 5. Are you right or wrong? You're not either one of those. You're the one who heard a voice say 2 plus 2 equals 4. And you one who heard a voice say 2 plus 2 equals 5. Just the way you hear my voice speak English, there's something in you speaking English or other languages. But either way, there's an observer of the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. So in hypnotherapy, we're frequently talking about a conscious mind and a subconscious. We do hint upon in the early stages of hypnosis something called superconscious, or you might call that higher self. Now, if you say, I'm a human being and I have a higher self, now there's always something higher. So that statement is somewhat true, right? I have a higher self, but who are you pointing to? Who are you referring to when you say you have a higher self? What if you are the higher self? What if there's a paradigm shift that says, wait a minute, there's a spirit here and there's a human here, and they're not the same thing, right? Anybody who's had an out-of-body experience or near-death experience, we just had our wonderful conference for the past 3 days. We had a lovely presenter, Dr. Abby Parsons, and she talked to us about one of her out-of-body experiences and a near-death experience. And she became wonderfully, it was the first time I heard her present. It was beautiful, beautifully, wonderfully spiritual, because she had direct experience of that which is higher. So consider that the human is the lower self. Spirit is the higher self. If you think you're a human, you have a higher self. If you know yourself to be spirit, you have a lower self. There's the beginning of transcendence. I observe my human, but I'm not this human, right? I'm not this body. You are not your body. There's always another level of transcending. So once you catch on, I can observe my body. I can transcend my body. Then you can transcend your heart, your emotions. That's another level. Then you can transcend your conscious mind. That's another level. So let's acknowledge 4 levels here, if you will. Body, emotions, which is your heart and your subconscious in this model. Then there's your conscious mind, and then there's you, spirit. But body, mind, emotions are essentially one unit. It's a bunch of parts that have come together to form a human being. You are the one who's having this human experience. What would be the value of transcending it? Well, it's quite often really good to get out of a mess that you find yourself in, right? To bring consciousness, to bring awareness to what might actually be dysfunctional, what might actually be a problem. When you're drowning in a pool of water, it's very hard to deal with your situation. If you climb out of that pool of water, well, now you can really take a breath and you could observe the pond. Say, oh, I was drowning in a pond, stirring up dirt and waves, and I didn't even know who I was. It got so dark and so murky, hence our word dysfunctional, that nothing was really working well, or maybe it was working kind of well, or, I got it together, but if it falls apart, it's really going to fall apart, right? Like overly leveraged in debts and a house that you really can't afford and more kids than you bargained for. Right? It's like you're holding it all together. And it might feel like on the edge of dysfunctional, even though you're holding it together. There's a whole nother way of living in this transcendent model that is extremely valuable. But my little there is to mention transcending isn't always the best answer. This talk about transcending the dysfunctional psyche can only go so far. Eventually, we have to do something about the problem. But what can we do by pulling out of the pond, by transcending the human being? Well, first we can bring awareness to it, right? We can say, well, if I get out of that pond, I can see what's there and maybe actually take a breath to deal with what's there. But something very amazing happens when we get out of the pond. It settles down on its own. When you go into deep meditation in a transcendent sense, your body, mind, and emotions naturally get quiet on their own. In Sanskrit, in the Yoga Sutras specifically, we have a term, a phrase, a sutra, called, or that says, Yogaschit Vritti Nirodha. And we've talked about this in our Yoga Sutras class, and I think I offered a free one of those, short one, for Monday night class. The term Nirod in that statement could be translated as suppressing or stopping the mind. But a better way to translate it would be the cessation of thoughts. Why does that happen with this idea of Nirod? Not because you stop your thoughts. Listen to the language. I stop my thoughts. That means the you, the spirit, the consciousness, if you don't like the word spirit, the consciousness has to use its own willpower to try to stop the psyche. That doesn't work. That's like putting your hands in the water to try to stop the waves. But it's the you who is splashing around in the waves that caused the waves in the first place. Right? We make more of a mess of the system by messing with the system. To understand that, imagine if you get a cut in your hand, and then you decide you're going to take a toothpick and start putting the cells back together. Right? There's a problem. Something needs to be healed. What's the best thing you can do after you wash your cut and put a Band-Aid on? Leave it alone. But every time you touch it, you make it worse. Like you break it, you buy it. What if you just kept hands off and just observe that cut? There's obviously a healing mechanism that I've heard it said, I forget where, I think it was in Chinese medical college, to diagnose, what was it? To fix is a doctors fix, doctors diagnose, God heals, something like that, right? Doctors diagnose, doctors try to fix, which, good, but God heals, meaning there's a force bigger than any of us that heals, right? Trees heal, things heal, animals heal, humans heal, not just the human body, but the human heart and the human mind heal. And one way to heal it is to transcend it, just get out of it, rise above it and observe it. How do you do that if you don't practice some form of inner work? Hypnosis can help for sure. Guided words, a guided meditation could absolutely get you into that higher place. But meditation really is the key. So if we're going to transcend it, we actually have to move into the I who's doing the observing. This leads to a key term in the idea of transcendence when healing your mind and healing your heart is the ability to observe. Like I said, observe your hand, but don't say, I am my hand. I'm observing my hand. Don't say, I am the wound on the hand. Say, I'm watching that wound heal. Why not do that with your heart? Just observe that it's upset. Next week, we'll talk about opening the heart and really what to do with the contents that are coming up. Half of that discussion deals with what we're talking about tonight, the ability to observe what's in your heart. If you don't practice that during the calm times, like maybe now, then when can't think of a better phrase, when the shit really hits the fan, what are you going to do if you haven't developed that higher seat of consciousness? So this idea of transcending, or that you are a higher self, that you are an observer of the human, that the human is in your awareness, you are the witness to a human being, right? You're witnessing a human life called the thing you call you. But let that you be a lowercase y, right? You can call that self, but it's a lower self. It's a body, mind, emotion complex. It's a vehicle, right? You're not your car. How do you transcend your car? Well, get out of it every so often, right? Pull back and observe it. Now, cars aren't human bodies, right? If you observe a machine, it suffers from entropy, right? If you just leave your car alone, eventually it will return back into the earth. I mean, it'll probably outlive you with plastic, but right, every physical form is eventually going to, or it is suffering from entropy, eventually will return to the earth. Entropy is like when you build a sandcastle, it's bound to fall. What's the opposite of entropy? Right? Everything suffers from entropy. It's like physical law. But the opposite of entropy is life. The opposite of entropy is life. You obviously have life force in you. In Chinese medicine, we call that qi, or there's ki, or reiki, or prana, or shakti. All right, we all, whenever we talk about this energy, we talk about the different names for it, acknowledging every tradition, for the most part, says, yeah, there's this universal life force energy. Whatever the healing force is, we know the body heals, right? And if you can pull out of it a bit to observe it, the heart settles in that state called narod. It's implied that the chit vrittis, meaning the fluctuations of your mind, like your heart-mind complex, will naturally settle down on their own when you pull back and pull out of the thing you thought was you, right? So the human is, just call it the human or whatever you want. Like, hey, that's my lower self. So instead of saying you have a higher self, we can learn to be that higher self. Now, is there something higher than that? Sure, there's always something higher. But if you just believe that I'm a human being and I have a superconscious mind, you might be missing the point that you are the superconscious mind. So what is that you? What is that self of consciousness? What is this awareness, and why is it so valuable? And then why is transcendence sometimes a trap and we want to go even deeper? But we really can't go deeper. Oh, I guess we could. But it's hard to go deeper until you know who this you is, right? How do we transcend the transcendence model until we've actually moved into it? The idea of finding this you is crucial to any spiritual path, really, because any spiritual path is going to say, who are you? Right? Ask the question, who am I? And one of the formulas that's used frequently in the yogic path is not this, not that. I'm not this hand. I'm not this emotion. I'm not my big toe. I'm not that sadness. I'm not that thought, right? I'm observing. Rhonda said, deeper, 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 right? The deeper model here, though, is deeper back, deeper up, or higher up. It's literally like you're extracting your consciousness from the human. What do we find out about that consciousness the more we observe it? It's actually very quiet. It's really not vibrating, which means it's still, right? So what is in the Psalms? Be still and know that I'm God. Not be busy, busy, busy and know. Be still and know. Your consciousness is still, right? If you're really present with me right now, making this class a meditation, you could have no mind in this moment, just for a moment. If you limit your breath for a moment and be really present, you're conscious. What do we know about that you? You're very peaceful. And that you, from my experience, is actually the real source of love. It is love. So consciousness, peace, stillness, calm, quietness, love, and bliss are attributes of consciousness. So why would we want to transcend the dysfunctional psyche? Because the higher self you, the superconscious you, the real you, is everything you've ever wanted to feel. But once we pull above, we can watch, and the system tends to heal itself. Now, what I found over 30 years now, being in the spiritual path and living in ashrams and monasteries, and specifically when I lived in India at an ashram there, the International Meditation Institute, they were very advanced yogis there. People had been on the path for 20, 30 years, but they came to me for me to do hypnotherapy on them. And after a lot of hypnotherapy sessions, I realized these people have transcended their psyche, but their psyches are still dysfunctional, meaning transcending is not enough. That's why this talk is like promoting transcendence, but also acknowledging that just to rise above the dirty pool of water does not get it as clean as you'd like it to be. Intervention can help clean up a dysfunctional psyche with the transcendent teachings. Yet, I'll go deeper tonight into Buddhist philosophy and what the Buddha did, which was very unique in the path of transformation. Hello, Matthew, who said, another Matthew, sometimes when I work with my emotions, I physically feel the sensations move through my body. If that's the case, where do emotions go when you release, and why do you feel them moving through your energy centers? Many times I feel it go up my spine into my head. Is it being released through my head? I would just suggest that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transformed. So where does it go? Where does ice go when it dissolves into water? Where does the darkness go when you turn on a light? Right? You could consider both of those analogies. Where does an ice cube, so you got an ice cube here, right? Your fear is considered cold or just whatever, anger. So there's this thing in there. When you pull back and observe, and we'll spend a lot of time next week talking about this, the opening the heart teaching. What do you really do with the energies that have been trapped in there? This talk is a little bit different, yet it's kind of considered a two-part series. So what happens to the energy that's in there it just goes back into the collective oneness of energy, just like an ice cube. Where do those molecules go? This question, though, is wonderfully asked, relates to Buddha's insight, and I'll get to that tonight. Where does it go? What if there is no it? Remember in The Matrix when Neo meets the spoon boy, right? And he's bending the spoon with his mind, and the spoon boy says, "Do not think you can bend the spoon with your mind. That's impossible. Just realize the truth. There is no spoon. There is no individual separate self in what seems like an individual separate self. It's an illusion that there's actually a you in this human complex. And we'll get to that in a moment. But where does it go? Where does the darkness go when you turn on the light? It doesn't even exist. So don't consider it as an individual separate self that has to go anywhere. It was an energy trapped inside of you because you held it down there in the first place. Right? If you have a repetitive negative emotion, it was suppressed and never allowed to fully flow through. By pulling back and observing it, breathing, relaxing, again, we'll talk about this more next week, it has a chance to get liberated. Where does it go? It dissolves. Because what is it? It's just energy. And then that energy gets to be part of the circulation again. All right, so I hope that helps. All right, so it's a little bit about transcending. Talk about it for hours, but let's go to the next slide. Dysfunctional. All right, what do we mean by that? Just a little bit more. Again, I'm not talking clinical or diagnostic, right? We are walking around human, good, light bulb moment, good. We're walking around as human beings dysfunctional all the time based on the standards of the great saints and sages of the world's religions, right? You study these men and women, they are drunk on God, on bliss, on love. They are filled with the Holy Spirit, or whatever you want to call that. There's wisdom, there's knowledge, there's joy, right? If those are our standards, then pretty much most of us are dysfunctional. I'm not talking about in psychology on the GAF scale, below a certain number from 0 to 100, dysfunctional. We're not talking clinical psychology. This word dysfunctional means you're not okay, right? You're not happy, you're sad, you're mad, you're angry, you get in relationship arguments in your relationship all the time. You have struggles with money. To me, that's all dysfunctional because it doesn't have to be that way. It's not a judgment. It's just a simple comparison to look at somebody who's very successful and somebody who's struggling. I'm just using the word dysfunctional for any kind of struggle because it doesn't have to be that way. The outside world sure appears to be dysfunctional. Right, we got viruses now. We got monkeypox going around, right? And there's recession blooming and looming, and we got wars, all right? And divisions all over the place. Okay, so we all know that, right? That appears to be dysfunctional. But why is that dysfunctional? Because the psyches of most of these people are in that category of dysfunctional, which means the inside is reflected on the outside, or the outside is a reflection of the inside. If you want to clean up your life or our world, you've got to clean up the heart and mind, right? All the toxic waste out there, which is dysfunctional, could be considered just a reflection of the toxic waste inside of most human beings' hearts. The people I found that don't have that anymore are the great saints and sages. So that's what our hypnotherapy school is modeled after. I didn't in college decide to study psychology or medicine. I chose philosophy and religion because I was asking, who are the most brilliant people? Who are the most liberated people? Who are the ones who achieve the highest states? And it's really the world's great mystics, saints and sages that have gone beyond dysfunction, right? They're gentle, they're peaceful, they're loving, they're kind. And the amazing thing about it, some of them get wonderfully wealthy because when they surrender to something higher, when they give their life up to that higher balancing, healing force, it harmonizes things. Transcendence, like I said, is a beautiful thing. You get out of that pond of water, it naturally wants to come back to balance. So transcendence not only helps to know who we are, it helps us to get out of the mud, so that the muddy water, so that it can get clear again. But what I want to talk about tonight is it doesn't always get clear on its own. All right. Hello, Daniel. Good to have you here. Said, would dysfunction really be an outward expression of karmic patterns? Yes, absolutely. Or cause and effect are one, right? Karma often discusses cause and effect. So let's say you have a headache. Just keep it internal a little bit. a headache, which is caused by anger. It's not that look at your words carefully, it's not that the headache is an outward expression of a karmic pattern. The headache is the karmic pattern. Once you see cause and effect as one, it empowers you as a healer, or let's say hypnotherapist, a facilitator, so much more, because if all I have to do is heal the anger and heal the headache, well, how quickly can I heal anger? Well, anger, where does that come from? Anger, your emotions come from your thoughts. How quickly can we change a thought? How quickly can you change your mind like that? This is how miracles happen, right? If I heal the belief that you're, let's say, powerless, which causes you to feel angry, but now you realize, hey, I'm really powerful. I can handle this. And you let go of the anger, it dissolves, it transforms, and now there's more personal power, love, confidence. All of a sudden, your headache gets better. Simply take that question that wonderful question you just asked, and relate it now to the external world, right? There's more shootings than ever before we've seen, right? Cause and effect. Well, it wasn't the gun that did it, right? It was the person holding the gun that did it, but it wasn't his hand that did it. Unfortunately, it's usually him. It wasn't his hand that did it. It was the mind controlling the hand. So just consider that subway shooting is a dysfunctional mind. Now, the karmic aspect of it, karma being just cause and effect, another word that would help there, which Daniel, you probably know from going through our school, is the word sanskar. A sanskar is a mental impression, and I just like to define those simply here, because it's a very complex topic, as belief systems, emotions, and memories, or in the order they go, memories causing beliefs, causing emotions. You have a memory with beliefs and emotions, and all that's stored in the subconscious mind, right? Your subconscious is your memory banks of, right? It's that place where your memories are stored and your emotions are stored. And it's very much your emotional heart. So sanskars are your karma. If you've got a blockage in there of anger and fear and hatred, any action you have that comes from that will be karmic, but it arose from a sanskar. Whatever you do that makes a mess in this world, cause and effect, comes from the sanskar. So a dysfunctional psyche is really the result of sanskaric patterns in our psyche that haven't been transformed, that haven't been liberated yet. One of the, yes, I meant karma in that sense. Then you got it, yeah. And you probably already had the answer to your question, right? But that's my response to it, which is whatever's going on inside of here is being reflected out there. The body cannot lie, right? Your conscious mind can make up falsehoods that don't seem aligned with what is, but the body can't, right? If you're angry and you get a stomach ache, right, but then you're turning to Pepto-Bismol or you're turning to cheeseburgers, you're trying to do something to make that feel better, cause and effect are one. So the sanskar is your karma. The mental block is the karma. That's what I mean by dysfunctional, right? Now, so thank you. Great questions. Now, what do we do with that thing, aside from formal therapy, right? Whether it's psychotherapy or hypnotherapy, whatever, what do we do? When we learn to transcend the dysfunctional psyche, we can observe it. But there's something else that happens in the unwinding of sanskars. If you study Mayor Baba's book, Discourses, he talks about sanskars, these negative mental patterns, simply stated, as winding a string around a pole or something like that, like a string around a pencil. The idea is the string is the dysfunction. It's the messy psyche. Now, how do we get rid of that? There's 5 ways he talks about. Transcendence is one of those ways. When we pull back and observe, we tend to stop doing the same insanity, right? A Course in Miracles says, once someone realizes that their thinking is mad, they will abandon mad thinking. Mad meaning like insane. And not like clinically insane. Course in Miracles just says, if you're coming from ego, you're insane. If you're living from a false self, you're insane. How can we stop living from that false self and let it dissolve? Pull back and watch it. Right? What's the best way to tame an ox? Give it a large pasture. Right? If you're fighting with that ox, that's rough, right? But just give it a large pasture and sit in your house and watch it. It'll become calm on its own. The other thing you can do, though, is you transcend, because imagine you're sitting higher up in your chakra system, higher up in your higher consciousness. Once you develop what's called the seat of the soul, where you can sit there and observe, you can sit there and look down, but you could also sit there and look up. That's the deeper, deeper, deeper. Not deeper into your heart. We'll go there in just a moment. This is talking about deeper into your transcendent higher consciousness. That state, the more you move into it, is called samadhi. Samadhi is another way to unravel the dysfunctional psyche, because we're not only observing it. When we're sitting here, we turn in and up and we start focusing in and up. We have just completely stopped giving that thing below any attention whatsoever for periods of time. So what happens to that ox if you told it, because he's dependent on you in some way, you just locked him up in a cage, in a fence, it's going to die eventually without you giving that system some attention, right? If you ignore something, it tends to drop away pretty quickly. If you have an uninvited guest in your house, right? Some guy just walked into your house and all he wants to do is talk to you about politics. And you're like, I don't want to have this discussion. Ignore him, right? It's one way to get him out of your house. You can watch him and not say a word, and he'll realize, God, this person's just not engaging with me at all. Or literally go upstairs to the other room. And then he'll be like, wow, I don't even have somebody who I think is listening to me. So those are two ways to consider how do we unravel this. If you want to go deeper into it, definitely just, and like for every reason, read Mayor Baba's book, Discourses. So with that said, that's a little bit about dysfunction, but what I really want to get to, and we have the psyche, but I want to get to the deeper Buddhist view of this. So what do we mean by psyche? In Greek, as I remember when I wrote my book, the sutra, what was it? I think it's in the Sutras on Healing and Enlightenment. Yes, it's in that book. I defined psyche from Greek, and it basically is spirit mind is what the word means. It's relating to not your body, right? But this, what they called in earlier Cartesian philosophy, the ghost in the machine, right? There's someone in there. Now, I'm not referring to your consciousness. I'm referring to the heart-mind complex. Okay, so don't consider your psyche just to be your conscious thoughts, because that's only the tip of the iceberg. The mass of who you are is subconscious, not the real you, right? But the human you, the lower self, is largely subconscious. You're not the one governing 70 trillion cells. You're not the one who makes a baby. You're not the one who heals cuts, right? Doctors diagnose, God heals. So we're not really even responsible for this thing called the psyche, but because we're in it and messing with it, that's where we create problems. Hey, Chris, good to see you again. Great to see and hear you. Right on, brother. So why do so many great sages and saints and spiritually advanced religious philosophy leaders turn out to be phony balonies? Thank you for your insights. Sure. My experience of the phony baloney phenomena is just the unhealed healer phenomena, and that even though a lot of us might look up to a quote guru or saints and sages, they're not necessarily as advanced as we think, right? If you only have $10,000, the guy who's got 100,000 is really wealthy, right? But 100,000 is a lot of money these days. I'm sure you could just consider that even though somebody might be able to run a marathon better than you, you can barely finish a marathon at all. And the guy who could, wow, he's like God. But, compared to the Olympic athletes, that guy's not that impressive. I was always into competitive cycling when I was younger, but I'm not really physically that strong. And I realized early on, I can ride my bike well when I'm 15 years old compared to hanging out with 40, 50-year-old guys who ride on their bikes. I was like, God, I'm amazing. But I get into competitive cycling with people my age, I got my ass handed to me, right? So my experience of what we call saints or sages or these kind of phony balonies are not actually really as far along as we think. I talk about this in my book, The Sutras on Healing and Enlightenment, about why do saints get sick, right? If psychosomatic illness can't happen in a healed psyche, then why would a saint actually possibly have psychosomatic illness or any kind of illness? There are answers to that, more than one, but one is they're not as far along as you think. There are a couple of rungs up the ladder. In A Course in Miracles, it says, if you're here on this planet, you still have ego. Right? That's it. If you're here, you have ego. In the Masonic tradition, they talk about falling from your high place. And most of these saints and sages have fallen from their high place. Why? Because they still had growth to go after the fall from the high place. It doesn't mean that they're not, I don't want to pick too many names, but the one coming to me now, who I referenced yesterday actually at our conference, is a wonderful being named Yogi Amrit Desai. He was the founder of Kripalu, and he was considered Guru Dev. He was Kripalu Yoga Ashram, or Center for Yoga and Health. Everybody was really seeing him as like real, and he was real high-level being. But that fell. There was a crash there, and he had to restructure himself. Anybody who goes through that type of dark night of the soul is usually a really great being. The higher you get, the more life tends to give you bigger challenges, right? If you're doing your 10,000 a year thing, but now you're doing 100,000 a year, there's usually more challenges with that type of functioning in business and picking arbitrary numbers. But now imagine running a company that's doing $1 million a year, right? There's going to be bigger responsibilities. So the saint sitting in the cave, how many mistakes can he make? The saint who's running a major yoga ashram with hundreds of people living around there with every kind of temptation you can imagine, certainly could look like there's going to be a fall. So I wouldn't actually say that these people are phony balonies. I would just say they're not necessarily as far along as we've judged them to be. But there are absolutely people, if you study the literature, who are truly liberated from all of that. Now, again, if you're on Earth, like, sure, you can make mistakes. I don't want to go too into this just for time, but to say, let's not judge them as phony baloney, but just say, yeah, they're further along and we can follow in their footsteps. But I always teach in our school, we were talking about in the conference over the past 3 days, take what you like and leave what you don't, right? So I reference one person, with all due respect, Yogi Amrit Desai from Kripalu. He offered so much goodness. But if you didn't like some of the other stuff, take what you like, leave what you don't. All right, Daniel said, so as we disidentify with that psyche, it heals itself. Great, thanks, Chris. Yes and no, that's part of what the talk is tonight. When you disidentify with the psyche, when you can just observe it, just like you stop poking around with your cut, it will heal itself to a degree. But can we actually be really wise and do something to speed up the healing process? Yes. So let's get towards that. All right, higher consciousness, I think we've discussed enough of what I wanted to, but since we're on the slide, just to get back into that, there is a you who could be considered the higher consciousness. It's called spirit, or the I am presence. It's the seat of the witness, or the seat of the soul. My teacher in India, he called it the knower, right? Who is the knower? In these philosophies, we often have the idea of an object of consciousness, which could be like my voice. Then there's the sense organ, which is the ear. And then there's a you who's in there hearing. That's the knower. That's the observer. That's the consciousness itself. It's higher in the sense that it can transcend the human, body, mind, and emotions. When you just watch the human from that higher space, the human does tend to heal itself to a really nice degree. Yet, no matter how far you go in that model, there's still going to be a piece of the puzzle missing. It's kind of like saying once you reach the top, you're going to come down again. There's a statement in Buddhism, they say, in the Zen tradition, when the ordinary, listen to the words carefully, when the ordinary man achieves enlightenment, he becomes a sage. And this is kind of like Chris' question. Why are they phony balonies? Well, they're not done, actually. When the ordinary man achieves enlightenment, he becomes a sage. When the sage attains true understanding, after that falling from your high place, it's not always a really negative experience, but it often is preceded by a dark night of the soul. When the ordinary man achieves enlightenment, he becomes a sage. When the sage attains true understanding, he becomes an ordinary man. So there's this idea of this descent. So what happened with Buddha? He achieved the highest states any of the yogis of the time had reached. Quick Buddha story, he was a high-level prince or something like that. His family was well-to-do. Nobody knows exactly, but they often say he was the son of a king. And Buddha realized, hey, they're suffering. I'm going to resolve that. Right? Good for him. Right? Pretty ambitious. At 29 years old, I'm going to resolve all suffering. So he goes out and he becomes a monk, essentially. And he studied with all the great saints and sages of his time. And he studied with a lot of them. And he would ask people, who's better than this guy? Who has the answers? Who has found the cause of suffering, the cure of suffering? No matter how far he went, he kept realizing nobody actually had that answer. But they were teaching what we've been talking about thus far. all of those people were talking about transcending into higher consciousness. That was the path. It was asceticism of the body, basically, and then try to get the spirit to not be bound to the body, right? Get out of your body, escape your body. Buddha was said to be able to put his consciousness into a condor, into a bird, and just be inside that bird for days, and out of body experiences. But he kept however you want to talk about that. But really, after 7 years of doing that, he kept coming back to the human. And he's like, you know what? I've only escaped suffering. So I haven't relieved suffering. I haven't totally solved the problem of suffering. So the transcendence model has been around for thousands of years. It's still around today. And if you practice primarily in the yogic path, you're definitely, or a lot of the New Age philosophies, you're going to hear about ascension or transcendence, right? We're going to go to higher dimensions, right? You hear in the New Age philosophy, we're going to be in the higher dimensions. We're going to ascend to the higher planes. Well, if that happens eventually, like the rapture in Christianity, great. We'll deal with that then. But that hasn't happened yet. It hasn't happened in 2,000 years since Jesus was here. It's not happening in the next second. It didn't happen the next second, right? The problem that we need to deal with is now. So if you're going to try to transcend the human, eventually you're actually postponing the process. Enlightenment happens at an instant, right? We had a couple of aha moments tonight, right? Like, you get it now. When you have what's called satori in Buddhism, it happens instantly. It has to be now. In A Course in Miracles, the question is asked about, is reincarnation so? And it says, even if it was, that's not where the problem is. The problem doesn't exist in a past that doesn't exist anymore. The problem exists now. So what did Buddha do after transcending all of this stuff? I'll make this slide big for a little bit. He moved into, well, let me say it this way. Buddha had intense concentrated power. He was a very advanced meditator. He knew how to put all of his attention in the higher consciousness and essentially transcend the human. And in that space, there is no suffering. It's perfect peace. It's perfect love. It's perfect bliss. Trust me, if you study Buddhism, he achieved that stuff. But after about 6.5 years of doing that, it wasn't a full 7 as I understand it, he did 6.5 years of intense sadhana or spiritual practice. He essentially did the yogic path. But then his last 6 months were spent under the Bo tree, where he just sat there. And what did he do? Instead of going up, 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 and out, and transcending, because he knew there's still a human here. I still come back to pain and suffering. He was asked to be a king. Some king met him and said, my God, you're such a great being. Why don't you rule with me? He said, I can't. I still have anger in me. He's like, even Buddha, when he was way more enlightened than most of us, still said, no, I'm not done. So it kind of relates to what Chris had asked. Well, the people who are called saints and sages, at Buddha's time, even the best ones weren't good enough for Buddha. He said there's got to be something more towards the path of liberation. So liberation from a dysfunctional psyche, essentially, but really from any pain and suffering. So what happened there that was so significant? Prajnaparamita could be considered an intense, deep, insightful looking. If you study the Prajnaparamita Hridayam Sutra, the Heart Sutra of Buddhism, that could be translated as the great heart of transcendental wisdom. Right? That's how we often translate the title of the Prajnaparamita, which is the word on the screen, Hridaya Sutra. The great heart, Hridaya means heart, so the great heart of transcendental wisdom. Prajnaparamita is often translated as transcendental wisdom. But if you understand transcendence in the way I just explained it, now you're talking about going up and out instead of down and in. Remember, when you reach the top, you must come down again. When the ordinary man achieves enlightenment, he becomes a saint. When the saint achieves true understanding, he becomes an ordinary man. It's the descent into the human which is actually going to bring you to the latter stages. But we don't really have to do this higher transcendence first. We could actually just practice Prajnaparamita right away. And I'll talk about that a bit now. However, practicing this deeper Buddhist meditation is actually really enhanced by doing the transcendence thing first. When you develop really intense concentrated power and meditation on your higher self, and then you realize, oh, I don't have a higher self. I am the higher self. You're established in the higher self. Yeah, the journey is almost done at that point. But now, because again, Buddha, 90% of his journey was that. The last 10%, if I'm not sure if 90 and 10 is the exact percentage there, but the latter part of his journey was taking that consciousness and diving very deep into the human. He just sat under the tree and he looked deeply into the 5 skandhas. So what is a skandha? The word means aggregate or a part. And it relates to the Buddhist idea of no self that I was answering one of your questions about. When you look at your car, you have rubber, right? Tires, you have steel belted radials, you got steel, you got air, you have rims, you have axles, right? All the parts of a car. But is there a separate individual self there? No, there's just a bunch of parts. You might think your car is a soul and a spirit, and that's all cute. But really, you just have a bunch of parts. And if you take those parts away, there's no more car anymore. Buddha looked deeply into all of the parts, all the skandhas, all the aggregates that make up the human being, because he kept saying, the problem is me, this human thing, not like me in the highest sense, but the problem is the human experience. No matter how much I transcend into spirit, I keep coming back to the human. That's where the pain is. That's where the emotions are. That's where the suffering is. So he took that intense concentrated power and he looked very deep inside of his being. He looked, number one, at form. He said, all right, well, the human body is form. But everywhere he looked, very, very deep, and we're talking extremely deep meditation into the form, he couldn't find an individual separate self. There was no one there that could suffer. Like, does your car suffer? No, it doesn't necessarily have a conscious soul who could actually suffer. It's only what Buddha realized was an individual separate self, which is the root cause of any dysfunctional psyche, right? The ego is the root cause of any dysfunctional psyche. Buddha looked very deeply at his body, and there was no ego. There was no separate self. It was just a bunch of parts. We know now from quantum physics that the atom is, the majority is empty space. I believe that's what Buddha was doing. He was looking into the essence of his body and saying, where's the me who can suffer? And there wasn't a me who could suffer. The body itself wasn't the cause of suffering. So then he started looking at his feelings. Oh, well, there's emotions or the sensations in the body must be the cause of suffering. There must be an individual separate self who has negative feelings. But every time he looked at a feeling, he saw that it was shunya or empty. There wasn't anyone home. So let me give you the synopsis of what this is. When you have anger come up, as an example, you have an emotion come up. That's a form of suffering in some way, right? You're not okay. You're upset. Your psyche not doing so good there. Consider just any upset is grounds for this practice. There's no small upsets in A Course in Miracles. Anytime you have an upset, to any degree, you have a chance to practice prajnaparamita. What do? You take your consciousness and you get intimate with the thing you're observing. Now, you're not the anger that you're observing, but you're not just trying to escape it. So, for instance, if we're talking about the ox who he left in the field, this would be, all right, the ox is an issue. I'm going to put a magnifying glass on that guy. I'm going to get so close. I'm going to figure out what's going on. And when he looked so close at his feelings that he stopped just trying to ascend or transcend or get away from, he got very present with them, right? Buddhism is largely about mindfulness. He was very mindful with his feelings. But the more he was intimate with them and so close to them, they would dissolve. There was nothing there. The person who kept saying, I am angry, he realized doesn't even exist. And then not just feelings like emotions, but feelings like sensations, right? Why do you have, let's say, discomfort in your hand? Well, whatever the reason is, Buddha would just go right into the discomfort. And at the very core of it, there was no one home. There was no separate self. And quite often in that state, the discomfort just dissolves away. Now, it's a complex topic of why, but it's a very powerful idea that one of the most advanced people who've ever walked on this planet, who respectfully Chris used the word phony baloney, who I would say was not a phony baloney. We have, from when Buddha was 29 and he lived up until like his 80s, we have a good 50, 60 years of that life story, much more than we have from Jesus, right? We have a lot of information about Buddha. And if you really look at what was he doing that made him Buddha, he was beyond the transcendence model. He was looking very deeply at human suffering, like looking at it right in the face. When he looked at perceptions, that word, actually, I believe it's the word impulses, which is the sanskar, right? We're talking about sanskars. I believe impulses is a Sanskrit for sanskar. A perception, whether it's right or wrong, is just like your point of view. And that could be like, hey, I'm looking to the left, I'm looking to the right, I'm smelling the lasagna. You have perceptions. But when he looked at the essence of a perception, there was no individual self. There's the consciousness, there's the sense organ, and there's what's being observed. But there was no individual self to suffer there. It's not an intellectual exercise. It's a being so intimately with what is that you discover there can't be suffering in that either. There's just a bunch of parts there who have come together. There's no problem here. Then he looked at the impulses or the sanskars, these tendencies, these mental impressions. And he was like, wow, part of me really wants, I don't know what he wanted back then, but like really wants ice cream. And part of me really wants ice cream. You go to the very core of that self, there's no one there. It dissolves away. If you're willing to let it go, you realize that impulse didn't have any substance to it. So there's no one who can suffer by not having his desires met because there's no self in that either. Then eventually what he really had to do was look at consciousness itself, right? Well, consciousness in the transcendent model must be the real you. But when you take prajnaparamita, the intense, concentrated power, the deep, insightful looking at consciousness, you find no separate self either. There's no ego. So if you're comfortable with the word ego to understand this part of the talk, there's no ego in your body form. There's no ego in the feelings. There's no ego in the perceptions. There's no ego in the impulses or the consciousness. Now, a lot of the negativity arises out of the sense of false self, but when you look, the false self just dissolves. The Zen master was asked, Master, I can't stop my mind. How do I stop my mind? Then the master said, show me your mind. And the student says, well, I would, but whenever I look for it, I can't find it. That's an example of prajnaparamita. Look for your mind right now. And just the act of looking makes it go away for a moment. Buddha discovered in all of this two essential truths. One is the doctrine of no self, or shunya, empty of a separate self. And that's why he realized we can eliminate suffering because there's no one there to suffer. Only a false self can suffer. Only an individual separate sense of self can suffer, and there just isn't one of those. It's not nihilistic, meaning like we're trying to destroy the self. We're looking so deeply at the self, we just discover there's nothing there. The other doctrine Buddha acknowledged, one is the false self. The other is what's called dependent co-arising. This is because that is, and that is because this is. Right? Consciousness in Buddhism really only exists because of an objective consciousness. If there's nothing to be conscious of, there's no consciousness. If there's no form, there can't be feelings. If there's no perceptions, there can't be form. The skandhas dependently co-arise. This is because that is, and that is because this is. Right? Your car is a car because of this and that, because of gas and a road and wheels and all that. We have a car, dependent co-arising. So Buddha saw that, there's phenomena occurring. The dharmas is the way they use that term there. There's the 10,000 dharmas, the 10,000 things, but there's no separate self to be found. So if you're only transcending the field, right, in the Bhagavad Gita, they talk about the knower of the field and the field itself. That's like the essence of transcendental philosophy is the Bhagavad Gita of Hinduism. The Prakriti field, all the energy manifesting into form, is observed by the Purush, the consciousness, the knower of the field. That is a transcendence model. And if you transcend into that higher self, you can make a lot of progress. When you're ready, then start studying Buddhism and say, well, what did Buddha do in those final stages? Essentially, if I could say, like who's qualified to say, but I believe the answer is prajnaparamita, this deep, insightful looking into the nature of the lower self, right? Because he knew himself to be the consciousness, according to that yogic model, right? He was a Hindu, but he became a Hindu reformer, taking it just a bit further. And really, it's those two doctrines of there's no separate self, number one, And number 2, everything dependently co-arises in the field of shunya, meaning the emptiness of the separate self. Daniel said, I can deeply relate to this. I went through that process of trying to ascend for years and years. Then my disregard, apologies. Okay, not sure. But I think I hear what you're saying in that paragraph, right? Years of trying to ascend, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not that it doesn't work. So here's what happened when I lived. Let me go back to a little bit larger screen for you. When I lived in India, there were, like I said, people at that ashram for 20 to 30 years. And then I would meet them and they had physical health issues, mental, emotional issues, behavioral issues. And so I started doing their hypnotherapy every afternoon. It's like, I didn't come here for this, but I ended up teaching yoga when I was there too. It's like, I didn't come here for this. But anyway, if you can help, you do. So while I'm doing hypnotherapy on people there, I eventually wrote my book called The Sutras on Healing and Enlightenment, because those people are very enlightened, but they weren't necessarily healed. They've only transcended their heart or their subconscious mind. They hadn't actually healed what was in the subconscious. So hypnotic regressions in an advanced yogi quite often reveals the same thing as any client who walks in off the street. They still have childhood sanskars. They still have that inner child who's hurt and wounded. You can transcend a dysfunctional psyche, and that can help a lot. However, taking your consciousness down into it, once you know you're conscious, right, that there's a you, this isn't quite Buddhist philosophy, more talking in the transcendent model or a yogic model. Once you know there's a conscious you and you have a wounded inner child, a part of you that's not doing okay, a dysfunctional psyche, be very intimate with that, right? What's one way to heal a child? Well, we could just watch him, but does that really help? We could ignore him. Right, you're a parent, child comes in your bedroom at night, mommy, help, there's monsters in the closet. If you just stare at him while he's saying, help, there's monsters in my bedroom. Well, how's that going to help? If you give him a large pasture to just run around with the monsters, how is that going to help? What's the best thing you can do? Well, actually get out of bed, give him a hug. For God's sakes, give that kid a hug. And then go into the bedroom and say, show me, where's the monster? Show me that thing which is causing you to suffer. And then you find there's actually nothing there. That's Buddhism, right? Embrace the child, say what's going on, right? So I would say this model of Prajnaparamita is more of hugging the child, knowing you're not the child, but he's like a part of you. He's an extension of you. Give him a hug, say, what's bothering you? Show me. And then when you look, you realize there are no ghosts. There is no individual separate self. By embracing the lower self, by embracing the dysfunctional psyche, by bringing love to it, we heal it. Think about in the model that you are spirit inhabiting your body. Wherever you go, life force will follow. If you go high, your energy will go up your chakra system to meet you. Wherever consciousness goes, energy follows. But if you leave your body for 7 total days, like really out of body experience, your body will die. It needs you, right? You have to be in your body for it to stay alive. If you've ever been there at the moment someone died, I had the honor of being in that experience once, where right there, I won't say who, but I am watching this person and then death, right? But it's like the spirit just goes bye-bye. So we all kind of know that, right? That there's a spirit in there. My grandmother once looked at our dog and said, there's a person in there. She knew there's a consciousness in there. We know that. If the consciousness is transcendent to the human, I was really accused in my early days of spiritual growth of being very ungrounded because I was just ascending as much as possible. But when you do that, you pull your energy out of your body. You pull your consciousness out of your body, your energy goes out of your body. That's going to cause health problems eventually because your body needs you to be in it. So the descent, the coming back down from the top of the mountain, the willingness to be in the human and deeply one with the human is actually more aligned with a more evolved, if I can say that, form of understanding of religious evolution, right? That Hinduism kind of becoming Buddhism, not that Hinduism doesn't have value with the yogic teachings, it's great. But remember, Buddha practiced that and realized there's got to be something more. What I saw the yogis in India, they could transcend the human, but they had all sorts of, I dealt with a woman, worked with a woman with rheumatoid arthritis. She was so kind of out of her body and so closed down that when we did breath work, her hands were in horrible. I mean, she had rheumatoid arthritis. Her hands were in a horrible technique. I got her to open her heart, to know how to deal with those emotions, and then get back down and into the human. Don't just transcend it. Embrace it, merge into it, honor that it needs you. Your bodily organs need you. If you're only transcending your body, you're not necessarily in your kidneys, right? If you're not fully down and in, then you're robbing your system of life force. But you don't want to be down and in the way most people are, where they're mixed. The spirit and the body, it gets all mixed, and then you don't know who you are. Yoga is like an extraction of the soul out of the body, essentially. However, like I've been saying, that's not the end of the journey. That duality has to be resolved, that there's a higher and a lower. So how did Buddha do that? He took the higher very consciously, and he went right in so deep that he discovered there is no spoon. There is no inner child. There is, I mean, it seems like it's there, but look very deeply at your inner child. Just keep being with that. Keep being with that part of your psyche. You will discover there's no one home. It's shunya. It's empty. The final liberated state is not a balance of an inner child, an inner parent, an inner adult. In transactional analysis, we have 3 ego states: parent, adult, and child. You've got to get that balanced. But once it's balanced, dissolve it, right? When we talk transactional analysis, we're talking about 3 ego states. Well, what's implied in that? Ego, right? Your inner child, as much as you can love that little person, is an ego. It's a false self. Now, you can tell that to someone right away because they have to learn to love it and stop suppressing it and embrace it because they think it's a real self. But once you really have transcended that, then if you can just take your consciousness and go right into any part of your psyche, you will discover there's nothing there. It's a mirage. It's not the real you. Be willing to let it go, because the real you, whatever that is, that's Buddha, right? What I mean by whatever that is don't define it, but you are Buddha. In Buddhism, you are that self. And in Hinduism, they say Tattvamasi, thou art that. In Hinduism, they talk about Atma, the self, but in Buddhism, they talk about Anatma, no self. It seems like a paradox, but I recently heard from one of our presenters, any good truth should be paradoxical, right? So you can spend years studying the Hindu version of self, which is Atma, that there is a self, and then the Buddhist version, Anatma, meaning there is no self. Again, you can transcend and find that higher self, but then eventually take that higher self, be very intimate with the lower self, and start looking at the nature of the lower self. You'll find your inner parent, there's nobody home, and even your inner adult, the intellect, there's no, or your rational mind, there's no individual separate self there. That was Buddha's final realization, where he was qualified with the word nirvana, or the deeper term there is anuttara samyak sambodhi, or complete unexcelled awakening. That didn't occur only through transcendence. That was the first stage. If you could break it down to 2 stages, ascending. Second stage, descend and practice prajnaparamita. Practice prajnaparamita. Consciousness gets very intimate with what it's observing until you see that there's no individual self in what you're observing. So practically speaking, you've got anger come up or sadness comes up. Take your consciousness and just be with it. Don't analyze it. Don't think about it. That's not what prajnaparamita is. Prajnaparamita is a very intense, concentrated power, a deep, insightful looking on the nature of phenomena. And when you discover, there's nobody actually who could be angry, the anger dissolves. You're not holding on to it. You're not suppressing it. You're not pushing it away. You're not psychotherapizing it. You're not regressing to the root cause. It's there. You be with it, and it dissolves. Try this with physical pain. In our school, in the clinical section, I teach this as a pain management technique. Somewhere it's in our resources, maybe the bonus resources, if some of you don't know. In clinical training and bonus resources, there's a teaching on prajnaparamita for pain management. If you try to transcend your pain, it's still screaming at you, right? If you're sitting meditation, your leg is killing you, or you're just trying to get out of the human experience, but the pain is too much, The other option of what you do with it is do what Buddha did. Go right into the pain. At the very core of it, yeah, it still hurts, but then because there's no you fighting with it, right? Suffering is resistance to what is. To overcome suffering, Buddha embraced what is, yet he was aware of who he was as consciousness, touching the object of consciousness. And then, in that sense of merging, that's where that emptiness of self is. Right? Even the consciousness itself is empty of a separate self. Obviously, this stuff can go really deep, but I hope I made that practical tonight. I'm open for any question answer. And then, like I said, we're trying to keep this class a little shorter because YouTube doesn't tend to like 2-hour classes. So we're towards the end. Let me just say I do have an advanced life mastery class coming up for anybody who's interested, July 30th, 2022. We also have an upcoming hypnotherapy training occurring towards the end of June. And we have a basic online NLP training, basic interpersonal NLP occurring in June as well. All right. So, yeah, thank you, everybody. Again, I'm open to any questions or feedback before I wrap it up. We are the International Association of Interpersonal Hypnotherapists. We're the Institute of Interpersonal Hypnotherapy, and one of our new projects is the Interpersonal NLP Society. So I'm honored to be sharing this information with you. Next week, we will be back here, same time, same place, 7 p.m. But ask questions if you got them or something. And then next week, we'll be talking about opening the heart and how to transform those emotions as well. All right, good to see you again, Chris. Daniel, good to have you here. Barbara, Rhonda, Mermaid of the Mountains, good to have you here. All right, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening. Thanks, Bill.